The engines of my B-17 Flying Fortress hummed their familiar mechanical purr as we approached the Japanese coastline. Below us, at 15,000 feet, the world looked deceptively peaceful, a patchwork of fields, villages, and winding roads that could have been anywhere. But I knew what we carried in our bomb bay, and I knew what was about to happen. My hands gripped the controls tighter than they needed to. Through the plexiglass canopy, I could see the target area coming into view. What I witnessed in the minutes that followed would change how I understood war, humanity, and my own role in both. The date was March 10, 1945. I was 23 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had volunteered to fight fascism. I thought I understood what that meant. I was wrong. What I saw below that day wasn't war as I imagined it. It was something far more complex, far more human, far more haunting than any training manual had prepared me for. If you're here to hear this story, stay with me until the end. Subscribe if these historical accounts matter to you, and let me know where you're watching from. To understand how we ended up in that cockpit, watching history unfold below, we need to go back to the beginning. I enlisted in 1943, driven by the summer age's anger that motivated thousands of young Americans. Pearl Harbor had shown us that the war wouldn't stay across the ocean. My older brother had been stationed at Icahn Field during the attack, survived the initial assault only to die 3 days later from burns at his stand while trying to rescue trapped airmen from a burning hangar. When the telegram arrived at our farm in Iowa, my mother collapsed in the kitchen, her floor dusted up and catching her tears. My father, a man of few words, simply nodded and said, "You do what you have to do, son." When I saw my first B-17 at training camp in Texas, I knew I'd found my purpose. The Flying Fortress seemed invincible, bristling with guns, built like a steel cathedral, capable of delivering justice from the sky. The aircraft stood on the tarmac like monuments to American industrial might, their aluminum skin gleaming in the harsh Texas sun. Each one weighed 36,000 pounds empty, could carry up to 6,000 pounds of bombs, and required a crew of 10 highly trained specialists to function. The complexity was staggering. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. 50 caliber machine guns positioned strategically throughout the fuselage. A northern bomb sight that could theoretically place a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. But beyond the technical specifications, each one represented hope, freedom, the promise that good would triumph over evil. Standing beside those aircraft, I felt connected to something larger than myself, a mission that stretched from the factories of Detroit to the battlefields of Europe, a collective effort to push back the darkness that threatened to consume the world. The training instructors told us we were the tip of the spear, democracy's answer to fascism. We believed them because we needed to believe them. Flight training taught me precision, discipline, and the sacred responsibility of commanding a 10-man crew. Each mission required absolute trust between strangers who they become brothers. My bombardier, Tommy from Boston, could thread a needle with a 500-pound bomb. He'd been a mathematics student at Mead before the war, spoke with a clipped New England accent that made everything sound like a lecture. My navigator, Hecke from Minnesota, could guide us home through flag and focus in nothing but stars and instinct. He'd grown up on a dairy farm, learned to read weather patterns by watching cloud formations roll across endless wheat fields. My gunners were kids barely old enough to shop, carrying the weight of a war none of us had started. Bill Kowalski from Detroit, whose father worked the Ford assembly lines, manned the ball turret underneath the aircraft. We learned to trust each other with our lives because we had no choice. In the air, we were one organism, 10 hearts beating in rhythm with 4 Wright R-1820 engines. The psychological preparation was harder than the technical training. Flight surgeons taught us about combat fatigue, the 1,000-yard stare that developed when you see too many friends die. Some of you won't make it home, the surgeon told us during one particularly sobering briefing. And some of you will make it home but won't really be home. By early 1945, we'd completed 37 missions over Europe. We'd seen Messerschmitt's claw through bomber formations like silver sharks, watched friends spiral down in flames over the Ruhr Valley, learned to compartmentalize horror for the sake of completing the mission. Each mission had taught us something new about the mathematics of survival. Over Weinfurt, we'd lost 3 aircraft from our squadron, 7 men who'd eaten breakfast with us that morning and never came home for dinner. I'd learned to recognize the sound of different anti-aircraft guns by their distinctive bark. The Herman 88S had a sharp, angry snap that could bracket your altitude in seconds. They developed the pilot's thousand yards turtle, that peculiar ability to focus intensely on flying while simultaneously processing the death and chaos happening in all directions. We thought with this in the worst of war. With the bomb factories, rail yards, airfields, targets that made sense, targets that felt justified. The Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, where they built the fighters that shot down our friends. The submarine pens at Bremen, concrete and the steel fortresses that sheltered the U-boats strangling Allied shipping. We were destroying the enemy's ability to wage war, protecting our own troops, bringing the conflict closer to its end. The moral calculus was simple, clean, comprehensible. Even when civilians died in those raids, it felt different. Collateral damage, the inevitable consequence of strategic bombing. We weren't targeting apartment buildings or schools, even if our bombs sometimes strayed from their intended targets. We could tell ourselves that their sacrifice was advancing the cause of freedom, that their deaths would ultimately save more lives by shortening the war. But Tokyo would be different. The briefing materials made that clear, even if the officers delivering them used sanitized language to describe what we were about to do. We were stationed in the Mariana Islands when orders came for a new type of mission. The briefing room felt different that morning. Colonel Matthews stood before a map of Japan, his expression grave. The usual pre-mission banter died as he began to speak. Gentlemen, tonight we're implementing a new strategy. Low-altitude incendiary bombing of urban areas. Our target is the residential and commercial area of Tokyo. The room went silent. Someone coughed. I felt my stomach tighten like a fist around my breakfast. The Japanese war machine depends on cottage industries scattered throughout civilian areas, the colonel continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. Small factories in homes, workshops in residential blocks. Aircraft parts manufactured in family businesses. Ball bearings produced in neighborhood workshops. The traditional distinction between military and civilian infrastructure doesn't apply in Japan. We're targeting the infrastructure of their war effort. Major Richardson, our intelligence officer, stepped forward with aerial reconnaissance photographs. These images show the density of small manufacturing throughout Tokyo's residential areas. Every neighborhood has workshops producing components for military equipment. Destroying these facilities requires a different approach than our precision bombing campaigns in Europe. He pointed to various sections of the photographs with a wooden pointer indicating what looked like ordinary neighborhoods. Here, aircraft wing components. Here, radio parts for fighter planes. Here, ammunition components. The entire city is essentially one large, distributed military factory. But we all knew what those words really meant. We'd be dropping fear on neighborhoods where people lived, slept, raised children. The incendiary bombs we'd be carrying weren't designed to destroy specific buildings, they were designed to create firestorms that would consume entire city blocks. M69 cluster bombs that would spread napalm hell across wooden structures, creating fires too intense for firefighting equipment to control. The technical language couldn't hide that reality. Jaque leaned over to me. Residential areas, he whispered. Jesus Christ. His face had gone pale, the freckles standing out against his suddenly ashen skin. Tommy was cleaning his glasses obsessively, a nervous habit he'd developed during our most dangerous missions over Germany. The gunners sat in uncomfortable silence, their usual pre-mission banter conspicuously absent. The colonel continued with altitude specifications, weather reports, defensive positions. We'll be flying at 8,000 feet, well below our usual bombing altitude. This will ensure maximum accuracy and maximum effectiveness of the incendiary devices. Fighter opposition is expected to be heavy initially, but Japanese fuel shortages should limit their ability to maintain sustained attacks. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. Gentlemen, this mission represents a new phase in our strategic bombing campaign. The effectiveness of this operation will determine the future conduct of the war in the Pacific. But my mind was elsewhere, trying to reconcile the boy from Iowa who they joined to fight soldiers with the man who was about to carry fear to civilians. I thought about my mother, probably at that moment hanging laundry on the line behind our farmhouse, humming one of the hymns she'd learned as a child. I thought about the Japanese mothers who would be doing the same thing in Tokyo that morning, unaware that their peaceful routines were about to be shattered by fear from the sky. Captain Morrison, who'd flown with the Dolittle Riders 3 years earlier, raised his hand. Sir, what about civilian casualties? The question in the air like smoke. The colonel's expression hardened slightly. Captain, our intelligence indicates that civilian workers in these cottage industries are combatants under international law. They're reproducing military equipment. The distinction between soldier and worker becomes irrelevant when the worker is manufacturing weapons said to kill American servicemen. The answer was technically correct and morally insufficient, and everyone in that briefing room knew it. The flight to Tokyo took place in darkness, our formation of 300 B-29S and B-17S moving like a deadly constellation across the Pacific. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, more bombers than had ever been assembled for a single mission in the Pacific theater. Inside our aircraft, conversation was minimal. Each man dealt with the approaching mission in his own way. Tommy cleaned his bomb sight for the tier team, adjusting and readjusting settings that had already perfected during the briefing. Hake rechecked our navigation charts, plotting alternative routes home in case we became separated from the formation. The gunners tested their weapons, the mechanical sounds of charging handles and ammunition feeds echoing through the fuselage like prayers to steel guts. He focused on flying, on the familiar vibration of engines, on the green glow of instrument dials. Flying a B-17 in formation at night required constant attention, maintaining precise airspeed, altitude, and spacing while watching for other aircraft in the darkness. At 25,000 feet, the world below disappeared into blackness. For hours, we existed in a bubble of mechanical sound and thin air, suspended between conscience and duty. The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath us, a black void that seemed to swallow light and sound. The aircraft's oxygen system hissed steadily, a reminder that we were flying at altitudes where human life couldn't naturally exist. The temperature outside was 40 degrees below zero. I found myself thinking about the previous night's letter from home. My mother had written about the spring planting, about how my father was considering switching from corn to soybeans. She'd mentioned that Mrs. Anderson's boy had come home from Italy, missing his left leg but alive. I wondered what it'd be like when he came home, whether he'd be able to sit on our front porch and watch Iowa sunsets without thinking about fear falling from the sky. As dawn approached, the Japanese coast materialized through morning mist. From our altitude, it looked serene, terraced hillsides descending to small coastal towns, fishing boats returning with their catches, the sprawling mass of Tokyo Bay stretching toward the horizon like a mirror reflecting the pale sky. Target in sight, Tommy called over the intercom, his Boston accent crackling through the static. That's when we began our descent to bombing altitude, lower than we'd ever flown over enemy territory, low enough to ensure accuracy, low enough to see details we'd never seen before. The altimeter unwound like a clock counting down to Judgment Day. At 8,000 feet, Tokyo transformed from an abstract target into a living city. It could see streets filled with morning traffic, buildings casting shadows in the early light, people beginning their day. Real people, moving through their morning routines, unaware that 300 bombers approached their homes. It showed a woman hanging laundry on a rooftop. Children walking to school in neat lines. An old man tending a small garden. From this altitude, they looked no different from the people in my hometown in Iowa. The recognition hit me like a physical blow. These weren't faceless enemies. They were human beings living human lives. The first wave of aircraft had already begun their runs. Below us, fires were starting, small orange blooms at first, then growing, spreading through neighborhoods built largely of wood and paper. The incendiary bombs created a chemical lead that consumed everything they touched. Even from our altitude, I could see people in the streets, tiny figures moving with increasing urgency as the fires spread. That's when I showed them clearly for the first time. Japanese women, running through the streets below. Not soldiers. Not factory workers. Mothers, sisters, daughters. Some carried children in their arms, babies wrapped in blankets who couldn't understand why their peaceful morning had suddenly filled with sirens and smoke. Others supported elderly family members, helping them move as quickly as their right legs would allow. I could see one grandmother, probably in her 70s, being assisted by what looked like her daughter and granddaughter, 3 generations fleeing together from fires they had no part in starting. The spreading fires had turned their peaceful morning into a nightmare they couldn't have imagined when they woke that day. From my altitude, I could see the pattern of their flight, not random panic, but organized evacuation. Families gathering at predetermined locations, probably neighborhood raid procedures they'd practiced but never expected to use. Some carried bundles of belongings, the most precious possessions they could grab before fleeing. Others had nothing but the clothes they wore. I watched one woman stumble and fall, overcome by smoke or fear or simply human terror. Her body crumpled to the pavement, and for a moment she didn't move. I held my breath, wondering if she was injured or dead. 10 others gathered around her, strangers, neighbors, people who could have kept running but stopped to help. They lifted her to her feet, one supporting each arm, then continued their desperate flight toward safety that might not exist. The simple humanity of that moment, people helping people in the midst of catastrophe, hit me like a physical blow. A group of mothers formed a protective circle around their children in a small park, looking up at our aircraft with expressions I could see even from 8,000 feet. Their faces turned skyward weren't filled with hatred or anger. They saw a terror. Pure, un diluted human terror. The same expression my mother might have worn if enemy bombers appeared over our Iowa farm. The same protective instincts that drove parents everywhere to shield their children from harm. I realized I was looking at people who were probably no different from the families in my hometown. Women who worried about their children's futures, who saved money for special occasions, who lie awake at night wondering if their husbands and sons would come home from war. They had names, histories, dreams that would never be fulfilled. The woman who had fallen might have been a schoolteacher. The grandmother being assisted by her family might have spent her life tending gardens and teaching children proper manners. The mothers protecting their children might have spent the previous evening helping with homework and preparing for what they expected to be another ordinary day. From 8,000 feet, the war stopped being about nations and ideologies and became about individual human beings experiencing the most terrifying moments of their lives. These weren't statistics in a strategic bombing assessment. They weren't acceptable losses in pursuit of military objectives. They were people whose only crime had been living in the wrong place at the wrong time in history. If this moment affects you as much as it affected me, let me know in the comments. These memories need to be preserved, even when they're difficult to bear. Bomb by doors open, Tommy announced, his voice professional and detached. Below us, the city was becoming an inferno. The fires created their own weather system, generating winds that spread destruction faster than people could flee. The women I watched were now lost somewhere in the smoke and chaos. I tried to tell myself we were targeting military infrastructure, that this was necessary to end the war, that we were saving lives by shortening the conflict. But in that moment, watching human beings flee in terror from the fear we were bringing, those justifications crumbled like paper in flame. I wasn't a liberate or a hero. I was a young man in a metal machine, running destruction on people whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of a war they hadn't started. The weight of that realization pressed down on me heavier than the flak jackets we wore over Europe. Bombs away, Tommy called, and our palo joined the thousands already falling on Tokyo. I felt the aircraft lift slightly as the bombs released, our mechanical burden transferred to the city below. The explosions created new fires that merged with existing ones, forming a firestorm that began to consume entire city blocks. Below us, Tokyo burned with an intensity I never imagined possible. The fires created their own winds, spreading the destruction in patterns that followed no logic except the simple physics of combustion. I banked the aircraft toward home, but I couldn't stop looking back. The woman who had stumbled, the mothers protecting their children, were they still alive? Had they found safety, or had they been consumed by the firestorm we helped create? The questions followed me across the Pacific like the smoke that rose from Tokyo, visible on the horizon long after we left the target area bend. The return journey passed in silence heavier than any we experienced over Europe. 10 men, each processing what we witnessed, what we done. The usual post-mission conversation about flag patterns and fighter encounters seemed irrelevant. We completed our objective without losing a single aircraft. The mission was a success, strategically speaking. But success felt like failure. Victory felt like defeat. When we landed, mechanics swarmed our aircraft, preparing it for the next mission. Officers debriefed us with clinical efficiency, asking about bomb patterns and defensive positions. The war machine continued its inexorable function, processing our reports, planning the next attack, maintaining the momentum that would eventually bring victory. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces looking up at us not with hatred, but with fear. Human fear, the kind that transcends nationality or ideology. The kind that reminds you that beneath uniforms and flags, we're all used people trying to protect the ones we love. In the months that followed, I flew more missions. Japan surrendered after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, weapons that made our incendiary raids look almost quaint by comparison. The war eventually ended, as wars do, with surrender ceremonies and victory parades. General MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri, and newspapers celebrated the dawn of peace. I returned to Iowa, married my sweetheart, raised children, built a life that looked normal from the outside. But part of me never left that cockpit over Tokyo. Part of Merriman suspended at 8,000 feet, watching women collapse in terror below, carrying the weight of that moment through every day that followed. The nightmares began within weeks of returning home. I'd wake in the middle of the night, seats soaked with sweat, hearing the sound of B-17 engines and smelling smoke that wasn't there. My wife would find me sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands as if they belonged to someone else. "What did you see over there?" she'd ask, and I'd tell her it was nothing, used dreams, used the war working its way out of my system. For decades, I told no one about what I'd seen. How do you explain that moment when war stops being abstract and becomes achingly, terrifyingly human? How do you describe the weight of carrying fear to people who never chose to be your enemies? The official story spoke of strategic bombing, of shortening the war, of saving American lives by avoiding a costly invasion of the Japanese home islands. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. A few months of bombing had prevented millions of casualties on both sides. But the mathematics didn't account for the faces of individual women whose terror I'd witnessed from 8,000 feet above. I tried to find redemption in the post-war narrative. Japan rebuilt, democratized, became one of America's closest allies. The cottage industries we'd destroyed were replaced by mother factories that produced cars and electronics instead of weapons. Perhaps their suffering had purchased something valuable, a lasting peace between former enemies, an end to the militaristic culture that had driven Japan to Pearl Harbor. But redemption felt incomplete when measured against the memory of that woman stumbling in the street, of mothers forming protective circles around their children. The strategic benefits of our mission couldn't erase the human cost, couldn't undo the terror I'd witnessed, couldn't answer the fundamental question of whether civilized nations should wage war against entire populations. The official story spoke of strategic bombing, of shortening the war, of saving American lives. They didn't mention the faces of the women who fell to their knees in fear. They didn't describe the sound a city makes when it burns, the particular quality of silence that follows the end of bombing runs. They didn't explain how it feels to be responsible for something you know is militarily necessary but morally indefensible. War, I learned, don't just destroy buildings and cities. It destroys the comfortable illusions that let us sleep at night. It forces us to confront the terrible arithmetic of survival, the impossible calculations that determine who lives and who dies. It asks questions that have no good answers and demands choices that leave scars on the soul. It transforms ordinary people into instruments of destruction, then asks them to return home and pretend they're the same people who left. I spent years trying to understand whether he was a hero or a war criminal, whether our mission had been a necessary evil or simply evil. The legal framework said we were soldiers following orders in pursuit of legitimate military objectives. The moral frameworks were more complicated. The answer probably contained elements of both truths, a paradox that no amount of analysis could resolve. The Department of Veterans Affairs eventually gave my condition a name, post-traumatic stress disorder, a clinical term that reduced the infinite complexity of moral injury to a manageable diagnosis. But therapy couldn't undo what I'd done or unsay what I'd witnessed. I'm telling this story now because those women deserve to be remembered, not as statistics or strategic targets, but as human beings who experienced terror in their final moments. Their fear was real. Their suffering was real. And my responsibility for that suffering was real, regardless of the uniform war or the orders I followed. They were mothers and daughters and grandmothers whose lives intersected with mine at the worst possible moment in history, and they deserve to be more than a footnote in the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II. The young men who fought that war are dying now, taking their memories with them. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it actually felt like to carry fear from the sky, to watch terror unfold below. These stories will survive only in history books that reduce human complexity to strategic analysis. If you want more stories told by the men who witnessed the war from the sky, stories that honor both the complexity of history and the humanity of all involved, subscribe. It helps ensure these memories survive, even the difficult ones with a rather forehead, even the ones that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of victory. Some things you see from the sky never leave you, and they never let you leave them.